the stories out there. I believed it was possible that once in the White House, even Donald Trump would appreciate the breadth of the challenges he was facing. So, in many respects, the book is the story of whether I was right in that prediction or not.
And how did you? I mean, did it live up? Did it live down to expectations? In your book, you called on your sort of ancestral skills from years of working with administrations that you were of being a square wheel in a round hole, or the other way around in administrations, on which strings to pull, who to call on, and how to play the bureaucrats against each other. And your book details how you go into this with some relish. And I must say, I read it with some relish, being a confirmed anti-bureaucrat myself. But I mean, what was it as bad as you thought? Did you think you managed at the end of it all to achieve what you wanted, despite the best efforts of so many people to frustrate what you wanted?
Well, I think with respect to President Trump, what became clear was that he was not operating on the basis of a coherent philosophy. He was not a conservative Republican. Now, I don't mean by that to say he was a liberal Democrat. He just wasn't anything. Philosophy, grand strategy, even policy were not the ways in which he addressed problems. He addressed them transactionally, ad hoc. Decisions could be made one day, reverse the next day again. It was hard to articulate consistent strategic objectives. It was certainly even harder to try to move toward these objectives. And this was something that I think troubled our allies very greatly and helped persuade our adversaries that they could take advantage of the administration. So there were things I think we did accomplish. I know not everybody watching may agree, but I think getting out of the Iran nuclear deal was a major step forward. I think that it was important to build up the military budget after very, very low levels during the Obama years, and I think progress was made there. And I try and lay out in the book, it's not a story of total gloom, in the sense that I think there were a number of correct decisions. The problem was, even when we got to what I consider to be the right answer, we didn't get there in a persistent, coherent way. And that has to be troubling, given the range of interests the U.S. has around the world, that it's not adequately protecting or advancing.
Look, we've got questions coming from the audience. You don't really, Ukraine is mentioned much outside, but in the context, Ukraine was often discussed, and you mentioned the words, a wall between, on what we see. You used the word a wall, which was not very apparent. This was an issue which many people reprehend, sort of, let's say, concerned that you did not go to the Senate to tell what you knew about this in the impeachment hearing, when it could have made a difference, and you waited for the book. Do you want to explain your rationale for deciding to wait till after the impeachment hearing, when you couldn't have a direct effect, and wait until now?
Sure, and I address this in the book in the chapter on Ukraine. Basically, my view was that the House advocates of impeachment badly botched the way they handled it. I call it impeachment malpractice. They turned it into a partisan fight that pushed away Republicans who might have been open to considering on some kind of objective level exactly what Trump's behavior was. They pushed the Republicans away in the House, and they guaranteed a partisan approach in the Senate as well. It's not hypothetical to say that we've had experience in the U.S. how to conduct impeachment on a more bipartisan basis. It happened in the Watergate scandal when Sam Ervin, a Democrat, and Howard Baker, a Republican, cooperated on the Watergate committee. There was none of that in the Trump impeachment effort, just as there was little or none in the Clinton impeachment effort of the late 1990s, which of course also failed. And my judgment was that after the House went one way and the other way and up and down and couldn't make its mind up, by the time the House finally voted, there wasn't anything that I could say that would have made a difference anyway. And so my feeling was that I was in the process of writing a book. And while it might not take a village to tell the whole story of the Trump administration, you can't tweet about it or write op-eds or even testify in Congress and tell the whole story. So I've laid the book before the American people. They can read it. They can make up their own mind. If an election campaign is not the best time to judge the character and competence of a president, I don't know what time is.
Many of the issues that you dealt with are very hot button issues at the moment. But amongst the recurring themes that come up are, well, let's start with China. It's quite obvious that, in a sense, you share the president's, let's say, obsession with China. In his case, which he's blamed for everything from bad chow mein to the virus. I mean, you lay out rationally what China did wrong about the coronavirus. But you don't turn this into a xenophobic rant the way the president sometimes does. But I mean, we have very serious questions here. And one of the things you often possess or claim is a realpolitik. At the moment, we have Hong Kong, which has just blown up this week since you wrote the book, when the Chinese Beijing imposed its security laws on Hong Kong. And there's the whole Taiwan issue in the South China Sea. Now, the attitude of previous pragmatists, I was thinking of your old Boston colleague, Jim Baker, was, do we have a dog in this fight? Now, on what rational basis in realpolitik, apart from whatever sentiments we have about freedom, could we, the US and the West, intervene in Hong Kong, for example? What rational steps could be taken to dissuade the PRC from what it's doing now?
Well, this is, I think, if we could take Hong Kong and then Taiwan separately. In the case of Hong Kong, following the one country, two systems approach, U.S. trade and other laws are designed to treat Hong Kong very differently than the rest of China. And what Congress is going through now is effectively changing those so that Hong Kong will no longer be deemed a separate entity subject to different American trade and other economic relations laws. That will have a very negative effect on Hong Kong, I'm afraid. And in a sense, by admitting that the Chinese have ended the one country, two systems policy, it's going to cause great difficulty for Hong Kong. One would hope that Beijing would appreciate this is bad for China as a whole and back away. I don't see any evidence of that at the moment. But internationally, let's not forget that the one country, two systems idea was enshrined in an international agreement between the United Kingdom and China. It's supposed to last for 50 years. We're roughly halfway through it right now. And the Chinese are ignoring it by not just the new legislation that they've imposed on Hong Kong, but by a range of other steps they've taken over the past several years. So that tells us something about what it means to China to make a commitment like that, even if there's no enforcement mechanism that the U.S. or the U.K. or anybody else can resort to. I think it says a lot about the nature of the regime in Beijing and should lead us to wonder how committed China would be to a trade deal, how committed it would be to arms control, how committed it would be to a range of things. Now, Taiwan, I think, is really very separate, although the one country, two systems approach was, of course, originally designed with Taiwan in mind. If there were any sentiment in Taiwan about a growing rapprochement with Beijing, I think what's happening on the streets of Hong Kong is dissipating that. I think the example of Taiwan really is so important now in East and South Asia that Taiwan is in a stronger position internationally than it's been really since 1949. And I think that's very important going forward. I think the example of how Taiwan behaved with respect to the coronavirus compared to how mainland China behaved is a very graphic example of the difference in approach of the two governments and really the two societies. So at this point, any enhanced Chinese provocations in the East China Sea, I think would be met with a very strong international response. And I think this is part of a growing transformation, not just in the United States, but in Europe, in Japan, Australia, Singapore, India, many places around the world, looking at the assertive policies we see coming from Beijing and realizing this is something that is a problem for everybody that has to deal with China, whether at the economic or the political level.
I can't imagine either Deng Xiaoping or Zhou Enlai being as stupid as this about the flagrant disregard of agreements, because it was one thing they tended to be quite punctilious about. But where do we go in terms of you report sort of fairly continuously that the president was somewhat reckless and careless of things like the Taiwanese rights, that were how the Taiwanese stood up, and we get the impression that if he could have put them in a package with a bow on and said, give me a trade deal, he would have handed it over on the spot. That's possibly an exaggeration, but possibly not from the way you describe it. How does it feel for people in Taiwan and other places to know that there's a transactional president who isn't going to honor anything any more than the Chinese are?
Well, I think it should be a cause for concern, and for Taiwan to increase its long time and very successful diplomacy with the United States Congress, where it enjoys very strong bipartisan support. Look, I write in the book, U.S. policy for 3 to 4 decades now has been based on two predictions. Prediction one, that after Deng Xiaoping rejected a lot of Marxist ideology and embraced more market-oriented policies, China's wealth increased, and people thought two things would flow from that. Number one, that China would be, and everybody knows the buzz phrases, a responsible stakeholder in international affairs. That has not turned out to be the case. China continues to steal almost everybody's intellectual property, engage in forced technology transfers, discriminates against foreign investment and trade. It's gaming the system. It's pursuing a mercantilist policy in what's supposed to be a free trade oriented international economic environment. And number two, it was widely predicted that the increase in domestic wealth in China would lead to greater democratization, that these village elections we used to read about 30, 35 years ago would spread to provincial elections, then you'd have national elections, and China would begin to look like other successful East Asian industrial democracies. In fact, the opposite has proven to be the case. In Xi Jinping, we've got probably the most authoritarian Chinese leader since Mao Zedong himself. So these two predictions that really underlay much of U.S. policy toward China for many decades now have proven to be wrong. And I think that's what's causing the second look at what U.S. policy should be. And we've heard from friends and allies all around the world when they complain about the Trump administration's handling of trade disputes with the EU or Japan or Australia. Why are you fighting with us when what we should be doing is joining together to deal with the real problems posed by China?
Well, one of the real problems posed by China is to the Uyghurs in the west of the country, which has been resolutely ignored, I think, by the president and others. Do you think there's any rational or reasonable pressure that can be applied to the Chinese for what are fairly clearly flagrant breaches of human rights and ethnic rights? Almost every charter about the rights of individuals and of collectives is being ripped up out there.
Yeah. Well, there's repression of the Uyghurs. There's obviously what's going on in Hong Kong. There's been repression of religious freedom for many years. And I think certainly what I advocated when I was in the administration, what I think is even more important now, when you see this kind of behavior, it provides an opportunity to put asymmetric pressure on China. So, for example, I've believed for quite some time that the United States should grant full diplomatic recognition to Taiwan. Now, people's attention is usually gotten pretty quickly when I say that. You don't have to do it all at once. But there are a number of things that the U.S. over the years inexplicably has done to satisfy Beijing for that, but that serve no American interest. For example, I met with my Taiwanese opposite number national security advisor in a U.S. government building when I was national security advisor, the new executive office building across the street from the White House. This caused huge ripples in China because American officials for years have had to go to a coffee shop to meet with a Taiwanese representative. That's ridiculous. It inconveniences Americans. We should be able to meet with who we want to meet with in American buildings. How's that for a radical thought? We should just invite Taiwanese in to meet with them. There are a series of steps we could take that would show to Beijing how displeased we are with their treatment of the Uyghurs, their repression in Hong Kong. It may not have an effect, but I think it signals to everybody that business as usual is gone. And frankly, I think if you're not prepared to recognize a freely elected representative government in a country like Taiwan, what's the purpose of diplomatic recognition to begin with?
Well, just on a parochial level here, of course, we've been protesting for years that Taiwanese correspondents are not allowed into the United Nations because of Chinese pressure, which is, but that's sort of symbolic of the international community's kowtowing to PRC. Very occasionally, people stand up to them. I don't think it was on your watch, but I remember when the Chinese were going to veto a peacekeeping force in Haiti because Haiti recognized Taiwan.
Right.
The chairman of the non-aligned, as it was, I think Ambassador Sommerville, went into them and said, there will be repercussions if you do this. And they backed down. That's the key point. This guy came to them and said, there will be repercussions. So they backed down immediately. But very few people have stood up about this or any other issue.
Right, exactly.
We have, the other issues that come up. One of the recurring themes in the book is how the son-in-law and the daughter of the president keep popping in and out of meetings. It's almost Zelig-like that they appear on all sorts of occasions. They appear in all sorts of photographs. And I think most astoundingly, they were left to negotiate the so-called deal of the century in the West Bank with possibly, most people tend to think, fairly catastrophic possible consequences. I mean, what type of personal diplomacy is this when the fact that you're a property magnate who's the son-in-law of the president makes you an expert on a very complex, fragile issue? Oh, and regardless of your sympathies, is this a good way to carry out foreign relations?
No, and it's a mark of the way Trump does business in a lot of areas. That in this case, Jared Kushner happened to be an employee of the United States, but certainly not in the NSC or State Department or other recognized channels. Just like the president used Rudy Giuliani in Ukraine, and who knows who he might be using in other countries. And I think, again, this confused our friends and allies. Who is it that they're supposed to talk to? And because officials in other countries want to make sure their message gets through, if they think that the only person the president's going to listen to is Jared Kushner, he becomes more and more important. And the efforts of the rest of the government to execute policy that they have been directed to execute get harder and harder to do. So one of the consequences of a second term, and I think I quote Mike Pompeo to this effect, he said to me one time, in a second term, it might be just the Donald, Jared, and Ivanka show.
Well, that's an even more frightening prospect than the current one. But you have, one of the issues that is current this week where things blow up, what type of, this happened after your watch, but why would there suddenly be an announcement of a deal of the century over Kosovo and Serbia? And what type of influence was behind that? Was that conceived when you were watching, or is this a new aberration?
Well, I did actually have comments to make on that from my time there because I felt that there were a number of steps we needed to be taking in the Balkans and Eastern and Central Europe generally to reduce the efforts of Russia to increase their influence, to try and restore a little bit of the Cold War flavor. So Ukraine, obviously the country most on the line, the one most directly jeopardized by Russian efforts. But I wanted to do some things that were somewhat unconventional. I wanted to reach out to Belarus, for example, to make sure that didn't get absorbed back into a greater Russia. And I found Poland and Ukraine receptive to the idea of trying to have more discussions with Belarus about their own security. I felt that in the Balkans in particular, with the proliferation of new countries there since the breakup of Yugoslavia, that the dangers of instability remained, and that with some of these conflicts and disputes not being resolved, that was fertile ground for somebody who wanted to cause trouble. So I think the resolution of the Macedonia name question, for example, hard for most Americans to understand why this was an issue, but it was, and I understand why. It was a big success. So that left some other problems that remained: Bosnia, Kosovo. And I thought it was worthwhile to see if we could make progress. Now, this summit meeting between Serbia and Kosovo wasn't really going to produce an agreement. And again, as you rightly say, it was not on my watch. I was watching from the outside. But struck me as the potential of one of these meetings that would be a photo op and not much more. And then it fell apart in any event. But the larger strategic point of guarding against Russian interference in the space of the former Warsaw Pact and Yugoslavia, to me, remains very important for the United States and obviously the Europeans themselves to pay attention to.
Well, similar to these issues, if we move further to the west with Kosovo, Macedonia, and the rest, what do you think the solution would be? Is the solution? Can you get people to make their own solution, or can you force them to make a solution? Do you impose the solution, or do you wash your hands and say, go rot?
No, I think in the case of Kosovo and Serbia, there were indications as early as 2018 that the leaders wanted to get these questions resolved because they saw they couldn't really get dependable economic growth and stability until their relations were normalized. This was very controversial inside both countries, but it seemed to me to be worth the effort. And one of the things they were discussing was the possibility of a land swap. Now, in parts of the Balkans, in Germany and places in Western Europe, that was greeted with dismay because they feared that a land swap there might lead to land swaps elsewhere. This happens in history. I mean, it's that's just something you have to live with. And the main thing was, are you really mean to tell me that if Kosovo and Serbia had reached agreement, part of which involved a land swap, that the rest of Europe would have said, no, that's not acceptable to us. We're going to reject the settlement that the two of you have worked out. I thought that was inconceivable. Now, there's still a long way away from it. In fact, some new obstacles have come up. But I think ultimately, you mentioned Jim Baker, who certainly was my mentor for many years. He once said to the Israelis and the Arabs that only the parties can make a lasting peace. We'd be happy to help. Here's the White House number. When you're serious, give us a call.
Very memorable. It's seared in my mind. But I mean, we're looking at the West Bank now. The Palestinians have been presented with the US are going to give the Israelis this that they've asked for, all the best parts of the territory that you're spread across. Is that an acceptable way to do diplomacy? Is it a way for lasting diplomacy, regardless of the ethics of it?
Well, I'm not sure what the administration is going to do, despite a lot of press predictions that it had made up its mind to support annexation if Netanyahu went ahead with it. It's not clear to me where the president really is on it. It's not clear to me at the moment where the government of Israel is. But I do think that what has changed in the Middle East is that many of the Arab states see the continuing, in fact, growing threat of Iran. And they look around, and it's pretty hard to get worked up about Israel being a threat to them in their interest, looking at the bigger picture region wide. And you've got the possibility of cooperation with large amounts of capital generated by oil revenues, together with investment and intellectual property assets that the Israelis have. That goes back to what people talked about in the 1990s about the new Middle East, a Middle East where economic growth is really possible on a widespread basis. And to ignore that possibility, I think would be to miss a real opportunity. So a lot of this is going to go forward, whether there's a solution for the Palestinians or not. I have my own proposed solution. I call it the three-state solution. I would give Gaza back to Egypt. I would divide the West Bank. I'd give Jordan sovereignty over the parts that Israel didn't have. And I'd work for there, because for the benefit of the Palestinians who need a functioning economy, I don't think the archipelago of a Palestinian state that they've talked about would work. I think you tie it into two real economies like Jordan and Egypt, and there's a better chance for the livelihood of the Palestinians themselves.
But they have to agree to it themselves.
Sure, I'm not sure that's as feasible as any of the other plans, but it's better than dreaming about a state that may never come into existence and probably wouldn't work anyway.
The other theme, apart from the Kushners and China, is of course Iran. Some of us, without being friends of the Ayatollahs, look at Iran and you see quasi-elections. Women get the vote. They execute almost as many people as the Saudis. But on balance, it's difficult for an outside observers to look at one and the other and say, well, the Saudis are so much better that we must really fall on our swords on behalf of the Saudis and the Emirates as compared to the Iranians. And my travels in the Middle East is that I don't think Iran has a big fan base, but I don't think the street is anti-Iranian in the sense that we're talking about here. It's the governments and the elites who are anti-Iranian for their own purposes, except in Lebanon, of course, where Hezbollah's managed to make itself unpopular.
Well, I think in Iran, it's the people who are anti-Ayatollahs as well. I think the support for the regime across the country is extraordinarily weak, and I think it's gotten a lot weaker since the reimposition of American sanctions. The problem, of course, is that this is not just an authoritarian theocracy. It's a militarized authoritarian theocracy with the Revolutionary Guards and others who have a monopoly on force. I think that the regime is actually more fragile than people think. As long as it controls the guns, it will stay in power. But I think, especially now with Soleimani sent to his reward, that you could see the possibility of fragmentation among the regular military and the Revolutionary Guards, and that the regime might well have difficulty in lasting. I'm not underestimating the difficulty, but I will say this: there's no one single answer to achieve peace and security in the Middle East, but the single greatest threat to peace and security is the government in Tehran. There's no doubt about it. Now, we've just seen a series of explosions two in the Tehran area, one at the Natanz uranium enrichment facility. Not entirely clear what's going on there, but it certainly is interesting that all these mechanical difficulties are occurring pretty much at the same time. I think this regime is vulnerable. I think that increased pressure is called upon. I wish our European friends would get out of the nuclear deal as well. And I think that ultimately, if we could get a new regime of almost anybody else other than the Ayatollahs and the Revolutionary Guard, the Middle East would be a safer place.
I think a lot of people might well disagree, like most of the Europeans at the moment, which brings us on to the next question of, you were a strong supporter of Brexit, as I gather. So what have you got against the European Union? I can understand lots of Brits still nostalgic for the empire. I think we can go and take back India, Australia, and the rest without European trammeling us. But how does this work with US? I mean, I'd always assumed that the US had the US assumed it had a vested interest in Britain being, the Trojan horse inside Europe, making sure that Europe didn't do anything that the US didn't want.
Look, I think what we've seen over the past 20 years is proof that the European Union is less than the sum of its parts. I think the West as a whole is weaker because of the European Union. And I think that's reflected in Trump's very strong view about why NATO members, obviously the EU and NATO are not coextensive, but why NATO members in the EU have not lived up to their own commitment about defense spending being equivalent to 2% of gross domestic product. I think getting Britain out of the European Union strengthens the West. And I'm looking forward to undoubtedly some hard negotiation, but a bilateral trade agreement with Britain. I think the Canadians will come into that. I think it'll show the enormous potential for economic growth that's stifled by the regulatory morass of the European Union. And there's a larger philosophical objection for me as well. I think the institutions of the European Union in Brussels are divorced from democratic legitimacy. And I think that's one reason that explains the animosity toward Brussels in many countries that are EU members. When I was at the UN, I detected the European Union wanting to spread the blessings of Brussels into the international system and do for us what they had managed to do for themselves, something I strongly resisted. So I believe Britain's Declaration of Independence is a great thing. I was there in 2016 on the day of the referendum. It was one of the most exciting political events I've ever observed. You could feel the palpable sense of people saying, actually, we just as soon govern ourselves. So I wish nothing but the best for the Brits, and I think the U.S. should do everything we can to make Brexit a success.
We've it's going to be an interesting few years because some of us have known Boris Johnson for a long time and see far too many resemblances between him and the president in terms of long-term policy planning. Will it win me next week's election?
Well, I don't see it that way. I think it was important for Boris Johnson to become prime minister because I think he had Brexit in his bones, and I think they're going to make a success of it. Obviously, COVID-19 has disrupted a lot of people's plans, but I think Boris is going to win this through.
You do? Oh, well, another issue we can roll in the mud on some other occasion. But when we're looking at, you have for many years, you've been opposed to international regulations, international lawmaking, and the general point, but in particular in disarmament. And many of the points you're making pragmatically about the disarmament pacts, do you see anything replacing them? You would discuss. You were involved in the negotiations on limitation of nuclear weapons and the START tests and so on. And apart from the philosophical objections, a lot of your objections in the book seem to be based on the fact that these don't really work anyway.
Yeah,
that they're a fig leaf to cover good intentions, but don't deliver practical results.
No, I think that's a fair statement. I think if you look at the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement, for example, that the Trump administration withdrew from, the Russians had been violating it for years. And the irony is there is only one country in the world that was covered by a treaty that prohibited it from developing intermediate range forces, and that was the United States. China wasn't bound by it. Iran wasn't bound by it. India and Pakistan, and the Russians were cheating. So what exactly was the advantage to the United States in staying in that?
Well, you could have stayed in and tried to expand it instead of ripping it up if you wanted.
Back in the Bush 41 administration, we considered that if you either have to make the Russians comply with it or you have to universalize it. Now, coming back to it 20 years later, do you think China's going to eliminate 2/3 of its ballistic missile force to come into the treaty? That Iran will come into the treaty? It's not going to happen. The cat is out of the bag. But now there's a very serious question with New START, the existing bilateral treaty between the U.S. and Russia. And I will take credit, and I did put it in the book to persuade President Trump, if you're going to negotiate another strategic arms limitation treaty, you ought to have China involved in it. It's not a bipolar nuclear world anymore. I don't consider wasting time on Iran and North Korea, but China's a serious player. It's a permanent member of the UN Security Council. And it's not enough to say, but China's got such a small arsenal compared to Russia and the United States, it's not fair to bring them in. What are we supposed to do? Wait until they get an arsenal that's as big as the US and Russia and then talk to them? I think China's making a mistake by boycotting these talks. I hope the administration sticks with the position that if we're going to have a new strategic arms reduction treaty, it's going to be with all three of those powers, and maybe the Brits and the French too. Why not?
I'm scanning the questions here as well. Your other big issue that came up was the sort of Korean games on the parallel with presidents popping in and out or not popping in and out. South Korean president's not allowed to greet the North Korean president. South Korean president is more accommodating than you and the US to the North Korea. So do you see another summit before the elections? Do you think any of the presidents are going to see a big photo up again, or have they blown this one?
Well, I think President Trump, everybody can read the public opinion polls. He's way behind. That doesn't mean the election is over by any stretch of the imagination. But, we have a phrase in the United States called the October surprise, just before an election. If the president felt he was in deep, deep trouble, another meeting with his friend Kim Jong-un might look like something that could turn things upside down again. But I think the North Koreans have basically shown exactly what they think of this whole process a couple of weeks ago when they literally blew up the building that they had constructed for liaison activities with South Korea. I think we wasted 2 years of activity and photo ops. And I think that North Korea took advantage of that by continuing its work on both its nuclear program and its ballistic missile program. So they weren't standing still. They were doing what proliferators always do, which is take advantage of time to advance their programs, thus leaving us, Japan, South Korea, in a worse position strategically.
Well, you speak of the October surprise. In a sense, October is the anniversary of the Great October Revolution, and we have the Soviets, or the Russians, I should say, allegedly putting out bounties on US soldiers with the Taliban. Did this come up while on your watch, or was it something that's new? This could be the October surprise for the election, surely.
Yeah. Well, not to comment on what went on, and when I was there, I don't have anything in the book about it, and I won't comment further. But look, I think when you have Russia or anybody else, but particularly Russia, which is a nuclear power, paying surrogates to kill American service members, that's essentially the same thing as Russians firing themselves directly at American service members. I'm confused by the administration's response. It's as contradictory and unclear as many other responses are. I found myself in agreement with Susan Rice writing in the New York Times yesterday, probably get both of us in trouble, that she said, if this information had come to me as National Security Advisor, fully corroborated or not, I would have alerted the president to it. I agree with that. I think he should have been told whether he liked it, whether we knew it for sure or not. It was apparently, according to the administration, sufficiently significant to tell allies in Afghanistan who might be mistaken for Americans so that we could have adequate force protection. I mean, I think this is a serious matter.
Well, this also comes, another recurrent theme in your book, which might surprise a lot of people, is your emphasis on the need to cultivate allies. Your reputation as an America first, not make America great again, but, keep it where it is at least, is belied by your constant attention and your berating of the president for neglecting allies, for not grooming allies, and not getting people together on side, and not building coalitions internationally.
Well, look, this is one of the things that worries me about a second Trump term. Is that the future of the NATO alliance, the alliances with South Korea and Japan, really almost all the alliances around the world, I think are up for grabs once Trump doesn't have to face reelection. One of the things that shows up again and again in the book is Trump making foreign policy decisions, even ones that I agree with, not based on the merits of the national security arguments that are made to him, but made on the basis that if he made a different decision, Republicans in Congress would react volcanically. So once that political guardrail is removed after the election, I think it's very unclear what a second Trump term would look like.
Well, I'm presuming it won't include you, because that's one of the questions a lot of the correspondents are asking. Whether you will, what your future plans are. I presume you're not predicating your future on being re-invited to join a future Trump administration on at least 2 counts.
No, I will not be waiting by my phone for that call, and I won't be waiting if Joe Biden wins either.
Well, it's you can't really tell him. I mean, he's capricious enough to think, "Oh, John, let's bygones be bygones."
Yeah. Well, anything can happen, as I say, in a second term, but that's not one I'd bet $1 on.
So, but looking into the future, I mean, many people from outside think that the administration, despite what I presume you acclaim to be your best efforts, has really terminally damaged the US prestige and global power in terms of being able to do anything, good or bad, for some time to come. Do you think it's repairable, that there are steps that can be taken? Because whether you agree with it or not, the withdrawal from the international institutions, the Chinese have rushed in to fill the vacuum, and they have people jumping at their Bolton Road bait, even if it is exactly what you say it is in terms of debt entrapment. How there's the old story about the Irishman who's asked for directions, and he says, "Well, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here." And that seems to me to be the mode at the moment. Can you think of a way out?
Yeah, as there's another saying, when you don't know where you're going, any path will do. And I think we're on that as well. Look, I think that the Trump administration has done damage to America's position in the world, but I think after one term, it's repairable. I think people increasingly understand that Trump is an anomaly. I think really whether he wins or loses, but particularly if he loses, the Republican Party has its own internal work to do to get this albatross off from around our neck. I'm more worried about the effect on the U.S. Of a second Trump term, which is the reason that for the first time in my adult life, I'm not going to vote for a Republican nominee for president. That's not to say I'm enthusiastic about Biden. I'm not going to vote for him either. I'm going to write in the name of a conservative Republican. It's not a happy election for me. But I do think that a one-term Trump presidency can be repaired. A lot of these international institutions are in need of substantial reform. The World Health Organization's performance on coronavirus was wholly inadequate. And we could go down the long list, but that's back to my first book on my time at the UN. And I don't think that the U.S. calling attention to these defects isolates us in the world. I think it shows those who are listening to the critique that they need to be much more careful before setting up elaborate bureaucracies that have meetings and issue communiques, but don't actually accomplish very much.
There's another issue which questions are popping up. Alan Dodds-Frank, a former ABC, wanted to ask about the Mike Flynn and Turkey, because he felt that there were moves to try and get Gulen extradited, that Trump was involved, and he thought that Mike Flynn was involved. And it's been very interesting to see how the president has dealt with Turkey, which is a mixture of keeping them at arm's length and once again kowtowing to them on particular occasions. It can't just be the Trump Hotel in Istanbul or Ankara or wherever it is.
Yeah, well, it shows the volatility of Trump's views. When we were trying to get Pastor Brunson released from prison and returned to the United States, we were imposing sanctions on Turkey and really put them under enormous pressure. And I think that achieved the result that we sought. Pastor Brunson was freed, but then Trump turned around and was basically prepared to accept Erdogan's request for the U.S. to pull out of northeastern Syria, which I thought was a mistake. We went up that hill, down that hill, back up it again several times. And I think the result has been more instability in Syria, less of an opportunity to get the ISIS threat resolved, Assad still in power, and Iran still with this incredible reach through Iraq and Syria, linked up to Hezbollah in Lebanon. So the Erdogan connection, I think, is very serious for NATO. This is not under Erdogan. This is not the Turkey that we worked with during the Cold War. I think our only consolation here is I think increasingly Erdogan does not represent the views of majority of the Turkish population. He suffered severe setbacks in local elections last year and perhaps more setbacks in elections to come.
We have one from Evelyn Leopold from Reuters of saintly memory, who you'd remember from the UN, of course. And she wants to know, do you have dealings with Rick Grenell again?
Well, I haven't spoken to him since I left the administration. He's obviously looking for a job. I don't know if, of course, if the administration only lasts another 6 months, it'll be a short job. But no, I haven't spoken to him. Give my regards to Evelyn.
Regards, Evelyn. But it's also, she points out that the EU's appointed Miroslav Lajcek, who is not a lightweight. Does that change anything about your prognosis for Kosovo?
Well, I think, as I said before, I really think Serbia and Kosovo have got to work this out together. And I thought, roughly a year and a half ago, that prospects were good. And serious Europeans, Tony Blair was involved in this effort, also thought there might be some prospect of a breakthrough. So I wouldn't give up on it. I don't think it's as close today as it may have been back then, though.
You have, well, we've also got a French correspondent who is asking about Me Too and its effect, because some of the comments that I think you record within the administration were not exactly on the cutting edge of feminism. Yeah. About the female colleagues in there.
Look, the president did this in the 2016 campaign when the famous Access Hollywood tape came out. Reince Priebus, his chairman of the RNC at the time, predicted he would lose for sure and should withdraw from the race. He didn't. He won. Reince Priebus became White House chief of staff. I think that this is part of the difficulty in looking at the polls and concluding Trump will lose for sure. But I don't think that he has picked up any support from people watching his personal behavior or his tweets or other things. I think many Republicans will either not vote for him or may vote for Biden because they don't like that approach. And I do think there's a serious issue about the demeaning of the presidency itself through his conduct over the last 3.5 years.
Well, it comes down to how existential an issue is it, Trump's second term? Would you be prepared to stand up and canvass campaign with Joe Biden against a second Trump presidency? Or do you prefer to be arm's length and on the side?
No, I'm going to write in the name of a conservative Republican. In 2016, I accepted the argument that you had to support Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. It was clearly one or the other who's going to win. I voted for Trump because I thought it was worth seeing if he could be made into a more mainstream Republican. But after working for him for 17 months, I can't, in good conscience, vote for him again. So I'm not.
No. And just getting back to this other question, do you have another book in the making, or a broader, more philosophical one? John Bolton's Guide to the World, 21st Century, or?
Well, it's possible. I think there will be an important philosophical discussion, certainly in conservative circles in the United States, that begins after the election. And really, whether Trump wins or loses, particularly if he loses, of course, it becomes more immediate. Because I think the United States continues to face a range of threats and challenges at a series of different levels: strategic at the China and Russia level, proliferation with Iran and North Korea, the threat of international terrorism. We've got Maduro in Venezuela, still a Castro regime, even without Castros in Cuba, the Ortegas in Nicaragua. So it is not at all a time for the U.S. to be withdrawing from the world or reducing its posture. If anything, it's even more important. And I think there's no national security wing of the Democratic Party. There's no Scoop Jackson wing anymore. So it is a very serious issue for the United States, and one that requires a more comprehensive, I think, philosophical look at America's place in the world.
Well, as a segue to go out, you mentioned Maduro and Venezuela. It's from your reading in the book, it's quite clear that the Maduro regime has very little popular support, has no economic basis, and it should have fallen when Guaido was declared the provisional president. So it's still there. Explain.
Well, I think it's there because of Russian, Cuban support, Chinese support, Iranian support. What are these people doing in the Western Hemisphere? I think we should continue to put pressure on Maduro. And by the way, one of the most important aspects of this opposition to Maduro and the support it has in the Western Hemisphere is this is not a made in Washington opposition. This is a made in Venezuela opposition that, with some significant exceptions across the Western Hemisphere, the opposition has support from the governments. And I think that's something that will have a lasting effect. I do believe Maduro will be overthrown, and I think that will have a lasting effect in the hemisphere.
It didn't affect you that Guaido's party was a paid-up member of the Socialist International, which I like pointing out to people.
The point was we're supporting what we think was the legitimate, the only elected, truly fairly elected body in Venezuela, the National Assembly, following a constitution, after all, written while Hugo Chavez was president. And support for Guaido was not about his views on economic policies. It's about his views of responsible popular government.
Just on the final one here, you were from your book, it was Donald Trump who thought that Venezuela was part of the United States, and secondly, that why weren't the troops in there? Why wasn't the cavalry in there cleaning up already? And you managed to pull him back from this, but that this isn't the role that you're cast in. You're not supposed to be the one who's holding back on military intervention.
Yeah, well, I was the moderate force on Venezuela, that's for sure, not in lack of support for Juan Guaido and the opposition. But, one thing I try and do in the book is describe factually how all of these things played out. And if it helps dispel the mythology that some have tried to create about me, that'll be a positive effect too.
Well, we're getting towards the end now. This is Ian Williams with the Foreign Press Association. We've been speaking to Ambassador John Bolton about his very readable book. I do recommend you to read it, because even if you disagree, you will learn a lot from it. And I hope that we can cross swords or discuss these things at more length. We can roll in the dirt on the UN at some point at your convenience. But thank you all for coming along. And thank you, Ambassador Bolton. Thank you to Jonathan King, who's been holding this together as we go. And maybe after the COVID virus, we can all get together and do the rolling in the dirt bit. But thank you very much, Ambassador.
Well, thank you, Ian. Thanks to everybody who tuned in, and wish we could go on longer. And if people have questions, they can get in touch. Happy to try and respond.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.